He guffawed in front of everyone and told her to call whoever she wanted. She obeyed, but when he found out who answered on the other end, his smile died, and the silence that filled that room changed everything forever. "You have 5 minutes to get out of this room before I call security." Mr. Kenneth Tan's voice sliced through the boardroom's silence like a blade. He leaned back in his chair, arms spread wide, a smirk on his face that was anything but friendly. At the long table before him, 7 executives watched the scene without moving a muscle. None of them dared to interfere. Not one. Miss Sarah Lim stood in the center of that room, holding a folder with both hands. She wasn't trembling, wasn't crying, but anyone looking into her eyes at that moment would know that inside, every word from that man was tearing apart something she had spent years building. "Mr. Tan, I just need 2 minutes to explain." 2 minutes? He interrupted, laughing loudly and looking at the executives as if inviting an audience to a show. "Folks, are you hearing this? The temp wants 2 minutes of my time." "My time? Do you know how much a minute costs, my dear?" Mr. David Chong, the legal director, cleared his throat from the corner of the table. He had known Kenneth for years and knew that when he started like this, there was no stopping him. Still, he tried. "Kenneth, perhaps we could hear what Kenneth cut him off without even looking. When I need your opinion on who deserves to speak with me, I'll ask. Until then, keep quiet." David lowered his eyes. The entire room lowered their eyes. Sarah took a deep breath. She knew she was treading on a minefield. She knew every second there was a risk, but she also knew that if she didn't speak now, she might never have another chance. She thought of her son. She thought of her mother. She thought of all the sleepless nights she spent studying those documents at the kitchen table while the world slept. She hadn't come this far to back down. "Mr. Tan, I found a serious inconsistency in the contract with the Mendonza Group. If you sign it as it is, the company could lose." "Could lose?" Kenneth rose abruptly, his chair spinning backward with the force of his movement. The entire room froze. He leaned on the table and bent his body towards her. "Who are you to tell me what I can or cannot lose? What are you here? A temp, not even confirmed. You've been here for a few weeks, and you already want to teach the company owner how to do business?" Mr. Gary Chua, the financial director, let out a low chuckle. It wasn't a malicious laugh. It was out of nervousness, but it was enough for Kenneth to feel validated. Miss Janice Wong, the operations director, looked away towards the window, pretending not to be there. At the back of the table, Mr. Raj Singh, the commercial director, repeatedly clicked the cap of his pen, the only sound apart from Kenneth's voice that dared to exist in that room. "See?" Kenneth spread his arms triumphantly. "Everyone here knows how things work, apparently, except you. A girl hired to organize files wants to review an S. Basher. M-E-I-L-L-E-L-I-L-K. Elasa, isantre. Kusta, elasa, isantre. Inde, si. I mansali fast. And a unifasali fast. Ena, tu, ar. Amas, amaskas. Amaskas. Si. Into this story. Inden. Mam. Do. Velas. Andes. 80 million contract. S. 80 million? Do you even know what that number means? Sarah felt her face burn, not from shame, but from indignation. Every cell in her body screamed for her to turn her back and leave, to preserve what little dignity she had left. But she remembered her son's voice that morning, before she left home. "Mummy, you're the bravest person in the world." Ethan didn't even know what courage truly cost, but those words were all she had at that moment. "I'm not trying to review anything, sir." She kept her voice steady, though her heart pounded. "I read the contract because it's part of my job to organize documents before forwarding them. And when I read it, I realized that the penalty clause is inverted. If you sign it this way, the one who pays the termination fee in case of breach is not the Mendonza Group, it's Lee Holdings." The silence that settled in the room lasted exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which the information hung in the air like a pinless grenade. Then Kenneth guffawed. A loud, scandalous laugh, the kind where a person throws their head back and wants everyone to see that they are not at all worried. "Inverted?" he repeated, clapping his hands. The girl said, "The clause is inverted." "David, did you hear that? You, with your law degree, who spent years studying contracts, a temporary archivist just told you that you made a mistake." David felt his stomach clench. Not because he thought it impossible, he knew the contract had been drafted in haste, but because he hadn't checked the clause Sarah mentioned, and that terrified him. He opened his mouth to speak, but Kenneth had already continued. "Kenneth, perhaps it's worth a quick look," David tried again, his voice almost a whisper. "Worth a look?" Kenneth turned to him, eyes blazing. "I'm going to waste my time because a glorified intern thinks she knows more than my entire legal department? Is that what you're suggesting, David? Because if it is, maybe I need to rethink who should really be sitting in that chair." David swallowed hard and said nothing more. The fear of losing his own job was stronger than any sense of justice. Sarah pressed her lips together. She felt every gaze from that table weighing on her like stones. 7 executives, all in silence, all watching, while a man destroyed her credibility without even checking if she was right. It was like being in a boxing ring with her hands tied. "You know what I think?" Kenneth continued, now pacing around the table, performing for his captive audience. He passed behind each chair like a predator marking his territory. "I think you saw some papers. You didn't understand anything because you don't have the background to understand, and you decided to play smart to impress someone. Maybe get a permanent position. Who knows? Maybe a raise. We see people like that every day, trying to climb using shortcuts. Isn't that right?" "No," Sarah said, her voice coming out softer than she wanted. She hated herself for it, hated that he had the power to make her voice shrink. "No? Then what is it? Explain to me, because I'd love to understand why someone who's been here a few weeks thinks they can walk into my boardroom, interrupt my schedule, and say my lawyers made a mistake." He stopped directly in front of her, too close, invading her space on purpose, as if to show who was in charge. His shadow covered Sarah entirely. "Mr. Tan," Sarah said, now looking directly into his eyes. And there was something different in her gaze, a firmness he didn't expect. "I know you don't know me. I know that to everyone here, I'm just a temp who organizes papers, but I'm trying to prevent you from losing a fortune, that's all." Kenneth tilted his head, feigning interest, as if watching a child tell an invented story. How lovely, how noble, the heroine of contracts. All she needs is a cape. More chuckles at the table. This time, Gary and Janice. Raj stopped clicking his pen and shook his head, looking at the floor. A younger executive, Miss Priya Devi, from compliance, clenched her hands under the table. She was visibly uncomfortable, but she didn't open her mouth. No one did. Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. She wouldn't cry there. She wouldn't give him that gift. She breathed slowly through her nose, counted to 3. "If you don't want to listen," she said, taking a step back, "I respect that. But I will formally register that I warned about the problem. It's the only thing I can do." Kenneth's expression changed. The amusement left his face and gave way to something colder, more calculated, like a snake that has just decided to strike. "Register? You're going to register?" he repeated, his voice dropping a tone. "Register where? To whom? Do you think anyone here will take seriously a registration made by a temp against the company president?" He turned to the executives, spreading his arms like a circus presenter. Would anyone here take that seriously? Silence. Heads bowed. No one answered. No one needed to. The answer was in the cowardly silence of each of them. Priya Devi closed her eyes for an instant, as if ashamed of herself. Kenneth looked back at Sarah, now with a smile that was almost pity. Almost. "Look, I'll give you some free advice, okay? Because I'm generous." He paused dramatically, looking at the table as if expecting applause. "Go back to your little corner, organize your files neatly, and forget this meeting ever happened. Because if you insist on this registering story, the only thing you'll manage to register is your departure. And then, my dear, good luck finding another job with a dismissal for insubordination on your resume." Sarah felt her legs weaken. Not from fear of losing her job, although that also haunted her, but because in that room, before all those averted faces, she was completely alone. No one would defend her. No one would even acknowledge that she might be right. She was invisible. She was nobody. She remembered the day she accepted that job. Madame Lim, her mother, had held her hands in the kitchen and said, "Daughter, no job takes away who you are. You go in, do what you have to do, and leave with your head held high. Always with your head held high." Sarah straightened her spine, turned her back, and began to walk towards the door. Each step weighed like lead. She could feel the relieved gazes of the executives. Relieved because the show was over, because they hadn't been saved, because they could return to the comfortable safety of cowardice. As her hand touched the doorknob, Kenneth fired off the phrase he should never have uttered, the phrase that would change everything. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the glass walls. "If you think you're right, call whoever you want. Call the Prime Minister if you want. Call God if you have the number. Because in here, my dear, the only person who decides anything is me." The guffaw that followed filled the entire room. Kenneth laughed. Gary laughed. Janice covered her mouth to hide her laughter. Raj didn't laugh, but he also said nothing. Priya clenched her hands so tightly that her nails marked her palms. The entire room was a stage, and Mr. Kenneth Tan was the lead actor in a play he thought he controlled. Sarah stopped, her hand still on the doorknob, her entire body motionless. She stood there for a few seconds that felt like hours. The laughter continued behind her like a cruel soundtrack. And then, slowly, she turned. She wasn't crying. She wasn't trembling. Something had changed in her gaze. It wasn't anger. It wasn't humiliation. It was a decision, a silent and unshakable certainty that only exists in those who have lost everything at least once in their lives and learned they have nothing more to lose. "You're right, sir," she said. Her voice calm, strangely calm. "I will call." The laughter diminished slightly. Kenneth raised his eyebrows, amused. "Who are you going to call? The Union? Media Corp? The patron saint of the city?" "No," Sarah replied, taking her phone out of her pocket. "Someone you know very well." Kenneth laughed once more. But now the laugh had a different note, a hesitation, a thread of doubt that he crushed before anyone could perceive it. "Go ahead, call." He made a sweeping gesture with his hand, as if giving permission to a child. "I want to see this. Everyone here wants to see this, right, folks?" Some forced smiles at the table. The executives thought it was just another scene from the show, another act of humiliation. Sarah unlocked her phone, opened her contacts, found the number, and did something no one expected. She put it on speakerphone. The sound of the phone dialing filled the entire room, each ring echoing through the glass walls like a heartbeat. One ring. Kenneth crossed his arms, smiling, waiting for the moment she would be embarrassed. 2 rings. The executives exchanged nervous glances. David squeezed his pen so hard his fingers were white. 3 rings. Gary placed his hands on the table as if preparing for something he couldn't name. 4 rings. Priya held her breath without realizing it. 5 rings. And then someone answered. "Hello." The voice that came from the phone made Mr. Kenneth Tan freeze. The smile died instantly, as if someone had torn his mask off with their hands. The color drained from his face. His arms fell to his sides. His mouth hung open, but no sound came out. He knew that voice, knew it like one knows the voice of someone who commands them. It was the voice he heard every time he attended a board meeting. The voice that signed the checks that funded the company. The voice of the true power behind Lee Holdings. The owner above the owner. The executives also recognized it. One by one, their faces changed. Gary's smile melted. Janice brought her hand to her chest. Raj stopped breathing. David dropped his pen, which rolled across the table and fell to the floor. No one moved to pick it up. Sarah looked directly into Kenneth's eyes, those same eyes that minutes earlier overflowed with contempt, and said, with an absolute clarity that cut the air like crystal, "Good afternoon. This is Sarah Lim. I need to speak with you about a contract that is about to be signed with the Mendonza Group. There's a serious error in the penalty clause, and the company president refused to listen." The silence that settled in that room was no longer the silence of spectators watching a show. It wasn't the amused silence from before, nor the cowardly silence of those hiding. It was the silence of those who realize they have just witnessed the beginning of an earthquake. Mr. Kenneth Tan, for the first time in Sarah's memory, had absolutely nothing to say. His lips moved, but no words came out. The executives were petrified. Gary looked at the table as if he wished to be swallowed by it. Janice's eyes were wide. Raj seemed to have aged a decade in 30 seconds. And on the other end of the line, the voice asked firmly and slowly, "Serious error? Tell me everything in the slightest detail, and I don't want anyone there to interrupt you." Sarah took a deep breath, felt her heart race, and began to speak word for word, clause by clause, with the precision of someone who wasn't there by chance. And at that instant, everyone in that room understood one thing. That woman they had treated as invisible for weeks. That woman who organized files and lowered her head when the boss passed by. That woman no one bothered to get to know, had just become the most important person in that entire building. Kenneth slumped into his chair, his legs weakening. He looked at the phone in Sarah's hand as if it were a weapon pointed at him. The man who controlled everything, who commanded everything, who humiliated anyone he wished, suddenly controlled nothing. But no one there, absolutely no one, had the slightest idea who Miss Sarah Lim truly was, or where she had come from, or what she had lost to get there, or the price she had paid to stand there at that moment, holding that phone with steady hands, while the voice on the other end of the line began to ask questions that would make Kenneth Tan lose much more than a contract. And when the truth came out, the whole, complete, devastating truth, no one in that company would ever be the same. Because this story isn't about a contract, it's about the day a man who thought he ruled everything discovered that the most powerful person in the room was precisely the one he tried to destroy. The voice on the other end of the line didn't need to shout, didn't need to threaten. Just one sentence was enough for Kenneth Tan's world to begin to crumble. "Kenneth, put this call on private mode now." It was an order, not a request. And Kenneth obeyed like a child who had just been caught doing something wrong. With trembling hands, he gestured for Sarah to take it off speakerphone. She didn't move. She stood still, phone extended, looking at him with a calm that made everyone in that room even more nervous. "Sarah," the voice continued, "can you explain exactly what you found?" And she explained, with a surgical clarity that no one in that room expected from someone who organized files. She spoke of Clause 14.3 TR of the contract, of the inversion of responsibility, of the financial impact the signing would bring. She used legal terms naturally. She cited articles of commercial legislation without consulting any papers. With each sentence, "Mr." David Chong's face grew paler because he realized she wasn't making anything up. She was right, completely right. When Sarah finished, the silence lasted for 6 entire seconds. 6 seconds in which no one breathed. "Kenneth," the voice finally said, "are you telling me you were about to sign an $80 million contract with an inverted penalty clause that, instead of protecting the company, would expose us to a fine that could break us?" Kenneth opened his mouth, but what came out was a stammer. The legal department reviewed it. David assured me that—" "David assured you?" the voice repeated. Then put David on. Mr. David Chong felt the blood drain from his face. All eyes at the table turned to him. Gary discreetly pushed his chair back, as if not wanting to be near a collapsing building. Janice looked at her own wedding ring, nervously spinning it on her finger. Priya Devi, for the first time, raised her eyes and looked at Sarah with something that looked like admiration. "David, I'm waiting," the voice insisted. David stood up on shaky legs, walked to the phone in Sarah's hand, and, his voice failing, said, "Yes, sir." What followed were the 3 longest minutes of David Chong's career. The voice asked questions he couldn't answer, requested details he didn't have, questioned deadlines he hadn't verified. And with each empty answer, each "I'll need to confirm," each "I don't have that information now," the weight on his shoulders grew like wet concrete. When the call finally ended, with a dry command, "No one signs anything until I get there personally. No one." The phone returned to Sarah's hand, and the boardroom looked like a battlefield after an explosion. Kenneth was seated but seemed smaller. His shoulders slumped, his gaze lost on some point on the table. The man who minutes earlier laughed loudly and told everyone to shut up was now the quietest of all. Sarah put her phone in her pocket, didn't smile, didn't make any comment, didn't look at Kenneth with vengeance or satisfaction. She simply picked up the folder she had brought, the same folder no one wanted to look at, and placed it in the center of the table. "The complete analysis is here," she said, with the same firm voice as at the beginning, clause by clause, with the necessary corrections, and she left the room, without slamming the door, without looking back. Her heels on the marble floor were the only sound, echoing like a clock, counting down a bomb. Inside, chaos began. Everyone spoke at once. Gary asked, "Who was that woman?" Raj wanted to know how she had that number. Janice was already calling HR, asking for Sarah's complete file. Priya leafed through the folder she had left on the table, and with each page she turned, her eyes widened further. "Guys," Priya said, raising her voice for the first time in that meeting, "you need to see this." Everyone gathered closer. The folder contained not only the analysis of the inverted clause, but a complete risk mapping of the entire contract. Every vulnerable point was identified, every solution suggested, every legal reference cited with precision. It was a job that would take an experienced legal team weeks to produce, and Sarah had done it alone. "This is senior counsel work," David murmured, flipping through the pages with still trembling hands. "No, this is work by someone beyond senior counsel. Who is this woman?" Kenneth said nothing. He remained seated, staring into space. But inside, a very different question hammered in his head. How did a temp he treated as invisible have the personal number of the most powerful man in the company? Not the office number, not the secretary's extension, the personal number. The number that not even he, Kenneth, the executive president, could dial without prior arrangement. Kenneth, Janice approached with her phone in her hand. I called HR. Sarah's file is strange. Strange? How? Too simple. Name, address, basic details, no detailed professional history, no references, nothing, as if someone intentionally erased everything, or as if she didn't want anyone to know who she is. Priya completed. Still leaning over the folder, Kenneth finally raised his eyes, and for the first time that day, there was no arrogance in them, no mockery, no superiority. There was something no one in that room had ever seen on his face: fear. Meanwhile, 3 floors below, Sarah walked through the car park towards the bus stop. Her heart still pounded, her hands still tingled, but she had no regrets. She had done what she needed to do. When she reached the stop, she took out her phone and called home. Mum, I'm leaving work. Is everything all right, daughter? Your voice sounds strange. Is everything okay? Give Ethan a kiss for me. Tell him Mummy's coming home now. He's right here asking if you brought the book he asked for. Sarah smiled for the first time that day. A tired smile, laden with everything she had swallowed in that room. Yes, I brought it, Mum. Tell him I did. She hung up and looked at the sky. It was getting dark. The bus would take over an hour to reach the HDB estate, where she lived with her mother and son, in a modest HDB flat that could fit entirely within Kenneth Tan's boardroom. But on that bus, sitting by the window, her reflection mingling with the city lights passing outside, Sarah Lim carried a secret worth more than everything Kenneth Tan had. A secret about who she really was, a secret about why she accepted that job, and a secret about the person on the other end of the line, a person who was not just the company owner, but someone who owed her something no money in the world could pay. And when that debt came to light, Kenneth Tan would discover that the contract was the least of his problems. The flat was on the top floor of a walk-up apartment block, in a neighborhood where the noise of buses blended with the sound of televisions from the neighbors. It was small, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that served as a dining room, and a bathroom with a shower that sometimes decided on its own that there would only be cold water that night. But when Sarah opened the door and saw Ethan running towards her, arms wide open and a smile that lit up the entire corridor, none of that mattered. Nothing. Mummy brought the book. She knelt, hugged her son tightly, and took a book about the solar system from her bag that she had bought from a street vendor near the bus stop. It cost what she would spend on lunch the next day, but the sparkle in Ethan's eyes was priceless. Did you know Jupiter has over 90 moons? He rattled off, already flipping through the pages as if each contained a treasure. 90 moons. Imagine the sky there at night. Sarah replied, taking off her shoes and feeling the relief in her aching feet. From the kitchen, Madame Lim appeared, drying her hands with a dishcloth. Just one glance, a single glance, and the mother knew something had happened. Ethan, go read your book in your room, my love. Mummy and Grandma need to talk for a bit. The boy skipped off, completely oblivious to the weight his mother carried on her shoulders. When the bedroom door closed, Madame Lim pulled up a chair and sat in front of her daughter. Speak. Sarah tried to smile, couldn't. The armor she had maintained all day in the boardroom, in the corridor, on the bus, finally cracked. And when it cracked, it crumbled. The tears came without warning, silent at first, then with sobs she tried to stifle with her hand over her mouth so Ethan wouldn't hear. Madame Lim said nothing, just got up, pulled her chair closer to her daughter's, and hugged her as if she was still a little girl who had fallen in the playground. He humiliated me, Mum, Sarah whispered between sobs. In front of everyone, he laughed at me. He called me a glorified intern, said I didn't understand anything, and no one said a word. Madame Lim tightened her embrace. She felt her daughter's body trembling against hers. And at that moment, the woman, who seemed fragile in the eyes of the world, was the strongest person in that apartment. Because holding a child's pain is the most brutal weight there is. And yet you stood your ground, Madame Lim said, her voice firm as a rock. Yet you didn't bow your head. I almost did, Mum. Almost. Almost doesn't count, daughter. Almost isn't a verb. You stayed, you spoke, you called. That's what matters. Sarah wiped her eyes and looked at her mother. What if I lose this job? What if tomorrow I get there and there's a dismissal letter on my desk? Madame Lim held her daughter's face with both hands. Then we do what we've always done. Get up, dust ourselves off, and find another way. But you will never, hear me well, never regret doing the right thing. Regret is for those who stayed silent. Sarah held her mother's hands, and they stayed like that, in silence for a long time. In the simple kitchen, with the sound of the old fan whirring in the corner and the smell of the pandan cake Madame Lim had left on the stove, the world outside, with its multi-million-dollar contracts and glass boardrooms, seemed to belong to another planet. That night, Sarah went to Ethan's room. The boy was already asleep, with the book open on his chest and his mouth slightly ajar. She carefully removed the book, covered her son, and sat there on the edge of the bed, looking at him. "I'll make it, my son," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I promised I'd give you a better life, and I will keep that promise, whatever the cost." Before going to sleep, Sarah opened a drawer in her bedroom closet. Under a pile of folded clothes was a box. Inside the box, documents, diplomas, certificates, letters, an entire world she had hidden, packed away, locked up, a life she had needed to bury to survive. She picked up one of the documents and ran her fingers over the paper. Her eyes welled up again, but this time they weren't tears of pain, they were of longing. Longing for who she was, for who she could have continued to be if life hadn't turned upside down. She put everything back, closed the drawer, and slept with the certainty that the next day would change everything. And it did. The next morning, when Sarah arrived at the Lee Holdings building, she noticed something was different. The security guard at the entrance, who normally didn't even look at her, raised his head and greeted her by name. At the reception, the attendant, who never said good morning, offered her a coffee. In the lift, 2 employees she had never seen before stepped aside to make room, as if she suddenly occupied more space in the world. The news had spread. Not the details, those were still boardroom secrets, but the essence. Everyone knew something big had happened, that the temp from the archives had stood up to Kenneth Tan, and that someone very powerful had answered an unexpected call. When the lift doors opened on the executive floor, Sarah found Priya Devi waiting for her. "Sarah, I need to talk to you now." Priya led her to a private room at the end of the corridor. She closed the door, looked around, as if checking that no one was listening, and said, "The company owner is here. He arrived early this morning, before everyone else. He's been locked in the boardroom with Kenneth and David for over an hour." Sarah showed no surprise, but her heart raced. "And there's more," Priya continued, lowering her voice. "Before going into the meeting, he asked HR to gather all documentation on you. Everything. Admission file, temporary contract, evaluations, everything. And what did they find? Nothing. Your file is practically empty, Sarah. No professional history, no references, no recorded academic background. It's as if you appeared out of nowhere." Sarah didn't answer. "Who are you?" Priya asked bluntly. Her eyes held no judgment, only genuine curiosity. "I saw that folder you left on the table yesterday. That's not the work of someone who organizes files. That's the work of someone who understands corporate law better than anyone in this building, including David." Sarah looked at Priya for a long moment. She saw something in her that she hadn't seen in anyone else in that company. Sincerity. Priya was the only person in the boardroom who hadn't laughed, the only one who seemed uncomfortable with the humiliation, and now she was the only one standing there in front of her, asking the right question. "Priya, I appreciate your concern, truly, but I can't tell you now. It's not because I don't trust you, it's because it's not the time yet." "When will it be time?" Before Sarah could answer, the door to the room opened. Miss Yvonne Go, the executive secretary no one had seen until now because she worked exclusively for the company owner, appeared with a serious expression. "Miss Sarah Lim? That's me. Mr. Thomas Lee wants to see you in the boardroom now." Priya's eyes widened. Thomas Lee was the founder of Lee Holdings, the man who built the empire from scratch. The name that appeared in newspapers, in business forums, on lists of the country's most influential people. The man no one had seen in person for years because he operated behind the scenes like a shadow controlling everything unseen. And he wanted to speak with the temporary archivist. Sarah stood up, straightened her posture, and followed Yvonne down the corridor. Each step echoed on the silent floor. Employees at their desks stopped typing, stopped talking on the phone, stopped breathing. Everyone watched Sarah walk towards the boardroom, as if witnessing someone enter an arena. When she reached the door, Yvonne opened it and gestured for her to enter. The boardroom was twice the size of the meeting room. A massive table, leather chairs, walls covered with paintings and awards. Kenneth sat at one end, looking like he hadn't slept all night. David was beside him with a folder in his hand and deep dark circles under his eyes. Both seemed smaller than the day before, much smaller. And at the head of the table, with his back to the window that showed the entire city at his feet, sat Mr. Thomas Lee. He was older than his voice on the phone suggested. His hair was completely white, his hands large and marked by time, and a gaze that seemed to pierce through people as if reading every truth they tried to hide. When Sarah entered, Thomas stood up. Kenneth and David did not rise, not out of disrespect, but because they were too paralyzed to move. Thomas walked slowly towards Sarah, each step carrying a weight no one in that room understood. And then he stopped in front of her. The silence was absolute. Kenneth watched, not understanding. David held his breath. Yvonne at the door brought her hand to her mouth. Because Mr. Thomas Lee, the most powerful man in that company, the founder of an empire, the name that made any executive tremble, had tears in his eyes. "I promised," he said. His voice choked, looking at Sarah as if she were the only person in the world. "I promised I would never let anyone step on you again." And Sarah, who hadn't cried in the meeting room, who hadn't cried in the corridor, who hadn't cried on the bus, who had held back every tear like someone holding a dam with their bare hands, felt the dam burst. Kenneth looked from Thomas to Sarah, from Sarah to Thomas, and finally understood that he knew absolutely nothing about the woman he had humiliated. But what he still didn't understand, what no one there understood, was why the most powerful man in the country was crying in front of a temporary archivist. That answer would come next. And when it came, it would destroy everything Kenneth Tan believed about power, about control, and about who truly deserves to be at the top. Kenneth didn't move. His eyes went from Thomas to Sarah, from Sarah to Thomas, trying to fit pieces of a puzzle he didn't even know existed. David had his pen suspended in the air, completely forgotten. Yvonne, still standing at the door, had her hands clasped over her chest, as if watching something sacred. Thomas Lee held Sarah's hands in his. His hands trembled, hers did not. "Please, sit," he asked, pulling up a chair next to his. Not across the table, not in a corner, but beside him, as an equal. Sarah sat down. Thomas returned to the head of the table, but before sitting, he looked at Kenneth with an expression that would chill any human being. "Do you know who this woman is whom you humiliated yesterday in front of the entire board?" he asked. His voice was low, controlled, but carried a tremor that was not of weakness. It was of suppressed rage. Kenneth opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "She's a temporary staff from the archives department." Thomas let out a bitter laugh. It wasn't a laugh of humor. It was the kind of laugh that comes out when the pain is so absurd that the body doesn't know how to react otherwise. "A temporary staff," he repeated, shaking his head. "David, do you also think that?" David didn't answer, just looked at the table. Thomas leaned forward, rested his elbows on the table, and looked directly at Kenneth. "Then, let me tell you a story, and I suggest you pay close attention, because when I finish, you will understand that you have made the biggest mistake of your life." The room fell into absolute silence. Outside, employees passing in the corridor slowed their steps near the door, trying to catch something. Priya Devi sat at her desk, but with her eyes fixed in the direction of the boardroom, waiting for any signal. Thomas took a deep breath and began. "Some years ago, I was on the verge of losing everything. Lee Holdings faced the biggest lawsuit in its history. A group of international investors accused us of fraud in export contracts. These were false accusations fabricated by competitors who wanted to drive us out of the market, but the evidence they put together was so sophisticated that no law firm in the country would agree to defend us. None. Everyone thought it was a lost cause." Kenneth frowned. He had vaguely heard about that lawsuit when he took over the presidency, but the details had never been shared with him. It was a chapter Thomas kept tightly closed. "I sought out the biggest names in corporate law in Singapore," Thomas continued. "I offered fortunes. No one wanted it, until a colleague recommended a lawyer to me. He said she was new, but that she had a legal mind unlike anything he had ever seen, that she saw things in contracts that no one else saw, that she dismantled arguments like someone disarming a bomb, wire by wire, slowly, without error." Thomas paused, looked at Sarah, his eyes shining. Her name was Sarah Lim. The impact of the sentence hit Kenneth like a wave. He looked at Sarah, the same woman he had told to go back to her corner and organize files, and for the first time truly saw her. Not the temp, not the girl he thought understood nothing, but a person with a history he had never bothered to ask about. "She took the case when no one else would," Thomas continued. "She worked for months without rest, entire nights at the office, entire weekends, immersed in thousands of pages of documents. She found inconsistencies that had gone unnoticed by dozens of lawyers. She dismantled each accusation, one by one, with a precision that left the judges impressed." David looked up, swallowing hard. As a lawyer, he understood the magnitude of what Thomas was describing. Dismantling an international fraud case was not a task for just any professional. It was work for someone exceptional. "She not only won the case," Thomas said, his voice growing heavier. "She proved that the accusations were fabricated. The investors were condemned. The company was saved. Everything that exists here, this building, these floors, these chairs where you are sitting, exists because one woman had the courage to take a case that everyone rejected. Kenneth swallowed hard. The air conditioning hummed in the ceiling, but he was sweating. After the lawsuit, I offered her a partnership in the company, a position as legal director, profit sharing, everything she deserved. Do you know what she told me? No one answered. She said, "Mr. Thomas, I didn't do this for the money. I did it because it was the right thing to do." And she refused. She returned to her career, continued practicing law, living her life. And I promised myself that if she ever needed anything, I would be there. Anything. Thomas paused for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was graver, heavier, as if each word cost him dearly. But I failed. The confession fell upon the room like a shower of stones. Sometime later, I received a call. It was from a hospital. They told me Sarah was hospitalized. Complete exhaustion, severe stress, physical collapse. Do you know why? He looked at Kenneth as if the answer was his fault. It wasn't, but the weight of his gaze made it seem so. Because after our lawsuit, her reputation soared. She became a reference, and that bothered a lot of people. Powerful people. People who wouldn't accept that a brilliant woman, who came from a humble family, who studied in a government school, could beat the best law firms in the country. Sarah lowered her eyes for the first time since entering the room. Madame Lim used to say that there are wounds that don't bleed on the outside, but never stop hurting on the inside. This was one of them. They started to sabotage her career, Thomas continued. And now, there was a controlled fury in his voice that made even Yvonne take a step back. Invented ethical processes, false complaints to the Law Society of Singapore, clients who received anonymous phone calls telling them not to hire her, contracts that mysteriously disappeared, witnesses who changed testimonies overnight. And no one did anything? David asked, his voice coming out almost unintentionally. No one? Thomas replied. Because those behind it were people with enough money and influence to buy silence. And worst of all, what I'll never forgive myself for, is that I found out too late. When I found out, she had already been stripped of her practicing certificate. She had already lost her clients. She had already lost her income. The silence in the room was the kind of silence that hurts, that tightens the chest, that makes a person swallow hard for no reason. And it stopped there? Thomas said, and now his voice faltered for the first time. He stopped, breathed, tried to continue. Her husband, Alex, was a university lecturer, a good man, a decent man. When Sarah's career collapsed, he took on everything himself. He worked in the morning, taught classes at night, took odd jobs on weekends, supported the family while Sarah tried to rebuild her life. But his body couldn't take it. Sarah closed her eyes. A tear rolled down her face, silent, alone, as if her body could no longer hold it in. Alex fell ill, Thomas continued. His heart, years of overwork, stress, carrying a burden that wasn't only his. When they found out, it was already too late. He passed away within a few weeks. He left Sarah with young Ethan. No income, no career, nothing but her mother and her dignity. Kenneth felt something he hadn't felt in years. A pressure in his chest so strong he had to lean his hand on the table. It wasn't directly his fault. He hadn't done any of that. But looking at Sarah, the woman he called a glorified intern, the woman he told to go back to her corner, he realized he had done something perhaps worse. He had repeated the cycle. He had been another person in a long line of people who looked at Miss Sarah Lim and decided she was worth nothing. When I finally found her, Thomas said, she was working as a temp here in my own company, organizing the files of a man who would be nothing without her. The sentence hung in the air like a judgment. I didn't know, Kenneth mumbled. How could I have known? You couldn't have known her story, Thomas replied, and for the first time he looked at Kenneth with something beyond anger. There was disappointment. The disappointment of a father who discovers his son has done something unforgivable. But you could have treated her with respect. You could have listened when she tried to speak. You could have had the minimal humility to consider that someone, anyone, regardless of their position, could be right. But you did none of that. You chose to humiliate. You chose to laugh. You chose to destroy someone's dignity in front of 7 people to feel important. Kenneth couldn't look at Thomas. He couldn't look at Sarah. He looked at his own hands resting on the table, and they seemed to belong to a stranger. And you know what hurts me most? Thomas continued. It's that she was there to help. She saw the error in the contract, an error that could cost the company $80 million, and instead of keeping quiet, as any sensible person would do after being treated like dirt, she walked into that room and tried to save the company. The same company that gave her no reason to be loyal. David let his pen drop, not from shock, but from shame, because he knew the error in the contract was his, and if Sarah hadn't spoken up, Lee Holdings would have signed a document that would destroy it. "Sarah," Thomas turned to her, his voice now gentle, as if speaking to someone carrying invisible scars. "I failed you once. I will not fail again. Tell me what you want me to do." Sarah wiped her face with the back of her hand, took a deep breath, and looked at Thomas with the same firmness she had in the boardroom when everyone was laughing at her. "I didn't come here for revenge, Mr. Thomas. I didn't come here to destroy anyone. I came here because I need to support my son and take care of my mother. I accepted the job that was available. I did the work they gave me, and when I saw the error, I did what my conscience told me. And what do you need now?" Sarah looked at Kenneth, not with hatred, not with anger, but with something Kenneth would never forget. With passion. "I need the right things to happen for the right reasons," she said. "Not because you know me, not because you feel guilty, but because it is just." Thomas nodded slowly. "And what would be just, in your opinion? That the contract be corrected before any signing, that the error be acknowledged, and that in this company, from today onwards, no one is treated as I was treated yesterday. No matter the position, no matter the contract, no matter who is in the room." The room fell silent for almost half a minute. No one dared to break the weight of that moment. Then, Mr. Thomas Lee did something no one in that company had ever seen. He stood up, looked at Kenneth and David and said, "You have just heard the woman who saved this company twice, and in return, once lost everything, and the other was humiliated. If any of you has an ounce of dignity, you will ensure that what she asked for happens, not for me, not for her, but because it is the minimum human beings should do for each other." Kenneth opened his mouth to speak, but Thomas raised his hand. "I'm not finished, David. The contract goes back for a complete review. I want an audit of every clause, and I want Sarah leading that review." "Sarah?" David asked, not hiding his surprise. "Any problem?" David lowered his head. "None, sir." "Kenneth," Thomas turned to him, "you and I will have a separate, long conversation, but before that, you have something to say to Sarah." Kenneth looked at Sarah, tried to speak. His voice caught, tried again. The words came out small, broken, unrecognizable from a man who had always spoken too loudly. "Sarah, I'm sorry." 3 words, just 3, but they carried a weight he had never felt before. The weight of knowing that the biggest mistake of his life was not almost signing a wrong contract. It was looking at someone and deciding, without knowing anything, that that person had no value. Sarah nodded, didn't smile, didn't say it's okay, because it wasn't okay, but she acknowledged it, and that was enough for now. Thomas accompanied Sarah to the door. Before opening it, he gently held her arm and whispered, low enough for only her to hear, "Alex would be proud of you. Very proud." Sarah felt the ground give way for a second, pressed her lips together, held back her emotion with everything she had, and replied with a choked voice, "I know. He's why I'm still standing." And she walked into the corridor. Priya waited for her. She didn't ask anything, just walked beside her in silence, as if to say, "I'm here," without needing to open her mouth. But as Sarah walked back to her desk, her chest still tight and her eyes still moist, she didn't know that the conversation between Thomas and Kenneth had barely begun, that in that boardroom, behind closed doors, even heavier truths were about to be revealed. Truths that connected the error in the Mendoza Group contract to something much larger, something that was not an accident, not carelessness, and not a coincidence. Someone within that company had put that error there on purpose. And when Sarah discovered who, everything she believed about that place and about certain people would finally crumble. Sarah began reviewing the contract that same afternoon. Thomas had a private room prepared for her, with access to all documents related to the Mendoza Group negotiation, everything from the first emails exchanged to the final version Kenneth almost signed. The table was covered with papers, piles organized by date, subject, sender. Sarah worked in silence, with a concentration that turned the world around her into distant noise. She read each line as if deciphering a code, compared versions, cross-referenced dates, marked passages with meticulous annotations in the margin. Priya appeared late in the afternoon with 2 coffees, placed one on the table, and waited at the door. "You can come in," Sarah said without looking up. "I thought you might need company, or caffeine." "Both, actually." Priya sat in the chair beside her and watched Sarah work. There was something hypnotic about the way she handled the documents, with respect, almost reverence, as if each sheet of paper contained a hidden truth waiting to be found. "Can I ask you a question?" Priya said after a few minutes. "You can. When you accepted this temporary job, did you know it was Mr. Thomas's company?" Sarah finally looked up at Priya, with an expression that mixed weariness and honesty. "I knew, but I didn't come because of him. The temporary employment agency offered me the position. I needed any job. When I saw the company name, I thought about refusing. But then I looked at Ethan sleeping on my mother's sofa and understood that pride doesn't pay the electricity bill." Priya felt a pang in her chest. It was the kind of sentence that doesn't need drama to hurt. It hurts because it's real. "And Mr. Thomas, did he not know you were here?" "No. I lost contact with him when everything fell apart. I changed my number, changed my neighborhood, distanced myself from everyone. I didn't want anyone to see me like this, especially him. Why? Because he knew me when I was someone, and I couldn't bear the pity of someone who remembered who I used to be." Priya remained silent. There was no answer to that, no comforting phrase that could reach the depth of that pain, so she did the only thing she could. She remained present without trying to fix what wasn't hers to fix. Sarah returned to the documents, turned a page, then another, then another. Suddenly she stopped. Her eyes narrowed. She went back 2 pages, read again, picked up another document from the pile next to it, opened it in the middle, compared one passage with another, and then her face changed. "Priya," she said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Look at this." Priya leaned closer. Sarah placed 2 documents side by side on the table. The first was a draft of the contract dated weeks before the final version. The second was the version Kenneth almost signed. Here, Sarah pointed to clause 14.3 inches the draft. "The penalty is correct. The responsibility is with the Mendonça Group, exactly as it should be." And here, she moved her finger to the final version. The clause is inverted. The responsibility shifted to Lee Holdings. "We already knew that," Priya said, not understanding where Sarah was going. "Yes, but look at the modification date." Priya looked. The correct draft had one date. The final version with the error had another date, a few days later. So far, nothing abnormal. Contracts go through several revisions. Now look at who made the alteration. Each version of the contract had an internal tracking code in the footer that identified which computer generated that version. Sarah pointed to the code in the final version. "This code is not from legal," Sarah said. "I compared it with the codes from other documents that came out of David's department. All of them start with leg, followed by numbers. This one starts with Finn." "Finn?" Priya repeated, and the color drained from her face. "That's the code for the finance department." "Exactly." The two looked at each other. The weight of that discovery filled the room like smoke. "Someone from finance altered the penalty clause of the contract," Sarah said, each word measured. "Someone opened the document, changed the responsibility for the fine from the Mendonça Group to Lee Holdings, and saved it as if it were the final version. Legal received the already modified version and approved it without noticing the difference. But this means it wasn't an error, Priya. It was intentional. Someone within this company wanted Kenneth to sign a contract that would destroy Lee Holdings." Priya stood up from her chair as if the seat had caught fire. She walked to the window, came back, walked again. Her mind raced. "The finance department belongs to Gary," she said. "Gary Chua?" Sarah didn't answer, just looked at her with that look that said everything without saying anything. "But why would Gary do that? He's worked here for years. He's a director. He earns a fortune. Why would he destroy his own company?" "That's the right question," Sarah said. "And I think the answer is here." She pulled another document from the pile. It was a printed email exchange between the finance department and a company called Meridian Investments. Apparently routine emails about investments and market projections. But in one of the emails, almost hidden in the middle of a long chain of messages, there was a paragraph that made Priya stop breathing. The paragraph mentioned, in a coded but understandable way for those who knew how to read it, a significant bonus that would be paid to an internal collaborator if the asset restructuring of Lee Holdings was accelerated via contract. "Asset restructuring accelerated via contract," Priya repeated slowly. "They're talking about provoked bankruptcy. They're paying someone in here to break the company. And if Lee Holdings went bankrupt because of a poorly signed contract," Sarah completed, "someone from outside could buy the assets for a fraction of their real value. Meridian Investments. Meridian Investments." Priya leaned against the wall and put her hands to her head. "Sarah, this is corporate fraud. This is a police matter. I know. We need to tell Mr. Thomas now. No, Sarah said. And the firmness in her voice made Priya freeze in place. Not yet. If we tell him now, Gary will know we're investigating. He'll destroy evidence. He'll contact whoever is behind Meridian Investments, and we'll lose the chance to prove everything. So what do? We need more. I need full access to the finance department's email history, and I need to see the server access logs. Who opened the contract from which machine? At what time? I can get that, Priya said without hesitation. Compliance has access to the system logs. I can pull the records without anyone knowing. Sarah looked at her. Priya, if anyone finds out what we're doing, you could lose your job. It could be much worse than that. Priya returned her gaze without blinking. Yesterday I sat in that boardroom and watched while they humiliated you. I didn't open my mouth. I didn't do anything. I stayed quiet like everyone else. And you know what I felt when I got home? Disgust with myself. So, if now I have the chance to do the right thing, I will do it, whatever the cost. Sarah felt a warmth in her chest she hadn't felt in a long time. The feeling of not being alone, of having someone beside her, not out of obligation or interest, but by choice, by character. Thank you, was all she said. But the weight of that word carried years of loneliness. The two worked together late into the night. Priya brought the server access logs. Sarah cross-referenced each piece of information with the documents she had. Little by little, the web unraveled, and it was bigger than either of them imagined. The computer that altered the contract did indeed belong to Gary Chua's department, but the records showed that the alteration was made outside business hours, on a day when Gary was traveling, representing the company at a conference. Someone used his access credentials, Priya said. Or he lent his password to someone. Or someone stole it. Or he did it remotely, Sarah added. Being on a trip doesn't mean he can't access the system from somewhere else. True. But look at this. Priya pointed to the screen. The access IP is not from the hotel where he was staying. It's a different IP from another city. Sarah wrote down the IP address and did a quick search. The result made her lean back in her chair. This IP is registered under Meridian Investments' name. The silence that settled in that room was the kind of silence that precedes storms. Heavy, loaded, inevitable. Someone from Meridian Investments accessed Lee Holdings' system using Gary's credentials, Sarah said, articulating each word like someone building a final sentence. They altered the contract from the inside out and let David approve a bomb without him knowing it existed. This is corporate espionage, Priya said, her voice trembling for the first time. It's more than that. It's a coordinated plan to destroy the company and buy the wreckage. Sarah stood up, walked to the window. The city sparkled below like a carpet of lights, indifferent to what was happening in that building. She thought of Ethan, who by now would be asleep hugging his book about Jupiter's moons. She thought of Madame Lim, who was probably waiting awake in the kitchen, worried. She thought of Alex, who was no longer there to hold her hand when the world weighed too heavily. Sarah, Priya said softly. What do we do now? Sarah turned. In her eyes, Priya saw something that frightened her and, at the same time, filled her with a courage she didn't know she had. Pure, absolute, unshakable determination. Now we find out who is behind Meridian Investments, because that name is a front. Someone real is moving these pieces. Someone who knows Lee Holdings from the inside. Someone who knows exactly where to strike. Do you think it could be someone from here? Someone we know? Sarah didn't answer immediately. She looked at the documents scattered on the table, at the lit computer screens, at the loose threads of a plot someone had patiently and maliciously woven. I think, she finally said, that when we discover who is behind all this, no one in this company will be able to look at each other the same way. Priya swallowed hard, and I think, Sarah completed, picking up her bag and walking to the door, that Mr. Thomas needs to know everything tomorrow, before whoever is behind this finds out that we already know. She walked out the door and down the empty corridor. The building was practically deserted at that hour. Her footsteps echoed in the silence like a countdown. And as she waited for the lift, her phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from an unknown number. 5 words that made her blood run cold. Stop meddling in what's not yours. Sarah looked at the empty corridor behind her, looked at the cameras on the ceiling, looked at the door of the room where she and Priya had worked all night. Someone knew. Someone was watching, and that someone wasn't outside the company, they were inside. Sarah didn't sleep. She sat on the bed with her phone in her hand, rereading that message until the 5 words lost their shape and became just smudges of light on the screen. Stop meddling in what's not yours. She thought about showing it to Madame Lim, but decided against it. Her mother already carried too much worry. She thought about calling Priya, but it was past midnight. So she did what she always did when fear struck. She went to her son's room. Ethan slept on his side, his mouth slightly open, and the book about Jupiter's moons slipping from his pillow. Sarah adjusted the book, pulled the sheet up to his shoulder, and stood there in the dark, listening to his breathing, as if listening to the only music that mattered. "I won't stop," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I didn't stop when they took my license. I didn't stop when I lost everything. I won't stop now because of a message." And she didn't stop. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the company before everyone. She had dark circles under her eyes, but also something in her gaze that Priya immediately recognized when she appeared minutes later with 2 coffees in her hand. "Something happened?" Priya said. It wasn't a question. Sarah showed her the message. Priya read it, reread it, and her jaw tightened. "When did you get this?" "Last night, when I left here. Someone knew we were working late. Someone saw us enter that room or monitored server access? That's what I think. And that's why we need to talk to Mr. Thomas now, before whoever sent this message has time to erase their tracks." They found Thomas in the boardroom alone, with a coffee that must have been cold for some time. He looked like he hadn't slept either. When he saw Sarah and Priya entering together with grave expressions, he straightened up in his chair and simply said, "Speak." Sarah laid everything on the table. The documents with the FIN code, the emails from Meridian Investments, the server access logs, the traced IP, and finally, the phone with the anonymous message. She presented each piece of evidence with the same surgical precision with which she had dismantled the lawsuit years ago. Priya supplemented with technical compliance data when necessary. Thomas listened to everything without interrupting, but anyone looking at his hands would see that his fingers were white from clenching the edge of the table so tightly. When Sarah finished, the silence lasted almost a full minute. Then Thomas said a single sentence in a voice so low that the two had to lean in to hear. "Call Gary here." Priya left and returned with Gary Chua in less than 5 minutes. He entered the room with his usual confident posture, adjusted suit, subtle smile, long strides, but when he saw the documents scattered on the table and Mr. Thomas Lee's face, the smile evaporated. "Mr. Thomas, good morning. You called me about sit, Gary." The order was so dry that Gary obeyed before finishing his thought. He sat in the chair Thomas indicated, the chair facing the table, like a defendant before a judge. "Do you know a company called Meridian Investments?" Thomas asked. Gary's reaction was almost imperceptible, almost a micro-movement in his eyes, a contraction at the corner of his mouth, the fingers of his right hand closing for half a second before returning to normal. But Sarah saw it. She had spent years reading people in courtrooms. She knew how to recognize a lie before it was even uttered. "Meridian Investments," Gary repeated, feigning thought. "I think I've heard the name. An investment company, isn't it? We receive contacts from dozens of them every month. Then you won't mind explaining why that company's IP was used to access Lee Holdings' system with your credentials and alter the Mendonza Group contract." All color drained from Gary's face, as if someone had pulled back a curtain and revealed everything he was trying to hide. This must be a system error. My password might have been Gary." Thomas interrupted. "I'm going to give you one chance, a single chance, because I've known you for a long time. You joined this company as an intern. I watched you grow. I promoted you. I entrusted the entire finance department to you. So I'm going to ask you once, and I need you to tell me the truth." The room was so silent that one could hear the clock on the wall, counting each second. "Did you participate in the alteration of that contract?" Gary opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the documents on the table, looked at Sarah, who kept her face neutral, looked at Priya, who didn't avert her gaze, and finally looked at Thomas, the man who had been almost a father to him throughout his career. And then Gary Chua crumbled. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't scandalous, it was silent. His shoulders fell first, then his chin, then his hands, which dropped from the table and hung at his sides, as if the threads holding them had been cut. "They approached me months ago," he said, his voice unrecognizable. "They said they were interested in investing in the company. They arranged meetings outside, always in discreet places. At first, it seemed legitimate. And then?" Thomas asked. "Then they started asking questions about the company's financial structure, about large contracts, about vulnerabilities. I found it strange, but they offered money, a lot of money. They said that if I helped accelerate a restructuring, I would receive enough to never have to work again." "And you accepted?" Thomas said. "It wasn't a question. I accepted," Gary whispered. and the confession came out as if something was being torn from within him. They sent me a program to install on my computer. It gave remote access. I didn't need to alter anything personally. They accessed the system using my credentials and made the changes. So you didn't alter the contract directly? Priya said. No, but I knew they were going to alter it. I knew what they were going to do, and I didn't stop them. Thomas leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, there was something in them that Sarah recognized, because she had seen it in the mirror many times. The pain of being betrayed by someone you trusted. Who is behind Meridian Investments, Gary? I want a name, Gary hesitated. His entire body fought against the answer, as if saying there was still time to retreat, to invent a lie, to save something. But then he looked at Thomas and saw in the eyes of the man he had admired for years a disappointment so profound that it hurt just to witness. Victor Lowe, he said. The real name behind Meridian Investments is Victor Lowe. Thomas didn't move, but Sarah saw. She saw his hand grip the arm of the chair so tightly that the veins popped out. Victor Lowe, Thomas repeated, as if the name tasted like poison. My former partner. Priya looked from one to the other, trying to keep up. Former partner? Thomas stood up and walked to the window. He stood with his back turned for several seconds, looking at the city below. When he turned around, he seemed to have aged in those few minutes. Victor Lowe was my partner at the very beginning. We founded the company together. Many years ago, I discovered he was siphoning money into personal accounts. When I confronted him, he denied everything. When I showed him the evidence, he threatened to destroy the company if I exposed him. So I exposed him anyway. I bought his share, ended the partnership, and thought I would never hear that name again. But he came back, Sarah said. He came back, and apparently, he didn't come to negotiate. He came to destroy. The silence that followed had weight. It had form. It was the kind of silence that changes the temperature of the room. Thomas turned to Gary. How much did they pay you? Gary lowered his eyes. They haven't paid yet. They promised payment would come after the contract was signed and the company started to fail. So you were going to destroy the company that nurtured you for a promise of money from a man who already stole from this same company? Gary didn't answer. There was no answer that fit. And the message? Sarah asked, showing her phone. That message I received last night. Was it from you? Gary looked at the phone. The shame on his face was so evident that it looked like a burn. The Meridian Investments sent it. They monitored server access. When they saw someone pulling records outside business hours, they called me, desperate. They told me to handle it. I tried to scare you to make you stop investigating. You tried to scare me? Sarah repeated, and there was something in her voice that made Gary look up. It wasn't anger. It was something worse. It was the sadness of someone who has been betrayed too many times to be surprised. I was trying to save this company, which you helped to hide, and your reaction was to threaten me. Gary opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Tears streamed down his face without him trying to hide them. They weren't tears of self-pity, they were of shame, of genuine and irreversible shame. I destroyed everything, he said, his voice broken. I know. I destroyed everything. Thomas looked at him for a long moment, then looked at Sarah, then at Priya, and then said, with the silent authority of someone who has built and rebuilt empires, Priya, I want all the documentation you two gathered to be duplicated and stored in a secure location outside the company system. Nothing digital, all physical. Yes, sir. Sarah, I want you to prepare a complete report on the fraud. Every piece of evidence, every connection, every detail. This report will go to our external law firm and to the competent authorities. Consider it done. Thomas turned to Gary for the last time. His gaze was not one of fury. It was one of mourning. The mourning of one who loses someone who is still alive. I trusted you, Gary. I watched you grow within this company. When you got married, I was your groomsman. When your child was born, I sent flowers to the hospital. I treated you like family. Thomas's voice faltered. He stopped, breathed, and continued. And you sold everything we built. Not out of necessity, not out of desperation, but out of greed. And that, I cannot forgive. Gary covered his face with his hands. The sound that came from him was not crying. It was something deeper, more visceral. The sound of someone who finally sees the exact dimension of what they have done and knows there is no turning back. You will be held legally accountable for what you did, Thomas said. But before that, you will tell us everything you know about Meridian Investments, about Victor Lowe, about every cent and every conversation. And you will do it now. Gary nodded without removing his hands from his face. Thomas walked to the door. Before leaving, he stopped beside Sarah and said, "Lo, once again. You saved this company, and once again, the people who should have protected it were precisely those trying to destroy it." Sarah looked at him. "I didn't do it out of gratitude, Mr. Thomas, nor out of vengeance. I did it because no one should lose what they have built because of the dishonesty of others. I know what that's like. I lived through it." Thomas held her shoulder with his trembling hand. "I know you did, and that's exactly why you are the strongest person I have ever known." He walked out the door and disappeared into the corridor. Sarah stood still, feeling the weight of those words. Priya approached. "Sarah, are you okay?" "I am. A lie." Sarah let out a tired smile, the first genuine smile in a long time. "It's a lie, but I will be. I always am." Priya placed her hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You're not alone in this anymore. You know that, right?" Sarah didn't respond with words. She just placed her hand over Priya's and squeezed. And that silent gesture was worth more than any speech. That afternoon, while Sarah prepared the report, Yanis Wong appeared at the door of the room. The operations director, the same one who had covered her mouth to hide her laughter on the first day, had an expression Sarah had never seen on her. "May I come in?" "You may." Janice sat down slowly, remained silent for almost half a minute before she could speak. "I laughed that day in the boardroom. I didn't say anything when Kenneth humiliated you. I stayed quiet like everyone else. And since then, I haven't been able to sleep properly." Sarah stopped writing and looked at her. "I came to apologize," Janice continued, her voice fragile. "Not because Mr. Thomas ordered it, not because now I know who you are, but because I should have done the right thing at that moment, and I didn't. And that shames me every day." Sarah observed her for an instant. She saw in Janice's eyes something she recognized, the pain of carrying a regret that doesn't fit inside oneself. "Thank you for coming," Sarah said. "It takes courage to apologize, more courage than staying silent." Janice nodded, her eyes glistening, and left without saying anything else. She didn't need to. That night, when Sarah arrived home, Ethan greeted her with a drawing. It was a rocket with 2 round windows. In the first window, a stick figure with a book. In the second, a stick figure with long hair and a big heart on her chest. "This is me, and this is you, Mummy. We're going to Jupiter together." Sarah took the drawing, pressed it to her chest, and felt tears come without asking permission. Not from sadness, but from something much greater. From realizing that everything she had faced, every humiliation, every closed door, every sleepless night, had a purpose. And that purpose was right there in front of her, with a toothy smile and a colored pencil in his hand. "Yes, my love, we will," she said, kissing his forehead. "We'll go wherever you want." Madame Lim watched from the kitchen door in silence, her hands clasped in front of her body, her eyes shining. She said nothing. She didn't need to. A mother's pride needs no words. It simply exists and fills everything. But as Sarah put Ethan to sleep and put the rocket drawing away with the documents in the drawer, in the same box where her diplomas, certificates, and letters from a life she thought she had lost forever were kept, she didn't know that the next day would bring the last and biggest twist of all, because Victor Lowe wasn't going to accept defeat in silence. And the blow he was preparing against the company was against her. Victor Lowe's strike came the next morning, and it came through the front door. Sarah had just arrived at the company when Yvonne Go intercepted her in the corridor, her face distraught. "Sarah, Mr. Thomas needs you in the boardroom, now. There's a lawyer here representing a certain Victor Lowe. He brought a court summons against you." Sarah's stomach dropped, but her feet didn't stop. She walked to the boardroom and found Thomas standing, arms crossed, facing a man in a dark suit sitting on the other side of the table. Beside Thomas were David Cheong and Raj Singh, both with tense expressions. The lawyer introduced himself as Mr. Marcus Coe, legal representative of Victor Lowe, and the summons he brought accused Miss Sarah Lim of corporate system invasion, theft of confidential data, and industrial espionage. "My client has proof that Miss Lim accessed confidential documents without authorization, manipulated internal records, and fabricated evidence to incriminate innocent third parties," Marcus said with a rehearsed voice that sounded like it had been memorized in the car. The room fell silent. Raj looked at Sarah as if expecting the floor to open up. David clenched his jaw so tightly that a vein throbbed in his temple. Sarah looked at the summons, read each line, each accusation, and when she finished, she did something no one expected. She smiled. "You can tell your client," she said, looking into Marcus's eyes with a disconcerting calm, that he is trying to put out a fire with gasoline. Are you threatening my client? I am informing you. Every document I accessed was formally authorized by the founder and owner of this company, who is in this room. Every record I analyzed was obtained through the compliance department, following internal protocols, and the evidence your client calls fabricated was confirmed by Gary Chua's verbal confession, recorded and witnessed. Marcus blinked. His confidence cracked like thin ice. Furthermore, Sarah continued, now standing up, I manipulated nothing. The IP connecting your client to the contract alteration is traceable. The emails between Meridian Investments and the finance department are authentic, and the remote access program installed on Mr. Chua's computer is already in the possession of digital forensics. Sarah opened the folder she had brought the complete report she had prepared the night before and placed it before Marcus. Here is everything organized, documented, and ready to be presented to the authorities. If your client wants to take this to court, I beg him to do so, because I have won much bigger cases than this, and this time, I am not alone. Thomas stepped forward. Mr. Ko, tell Victor that he had a chance to disappear quietly. He chose to come back. Now he will face the consequences. You may leave. Marcus Ko collected his papers with visibly trembling hands, stood up without a word, and exited the door. No one accompanied him. No one needed to. When the door closed, Raj Singh, the same man who had remained silent throughout the humiliation of the first day, turned to Sarah and said with a choked voice, I should have said this sooner, but I didn't have the courage. So I'll say it now. Thank you. Thank you for doing what none of us did. Sarah nodded and accepted it. Days later, the authorities received the complete report. The investigation into Victor Lowe and Meridian Investments was formally opened. Gary Chua collaborated fully, handing over conversations, contacts, and every detail of the scheme. Justice took its course. The contract with the Mendonça Group was entirely revised under Sarah's supervision. Every clause rewritten, every risk eliminated, every line reinforced. When Kenneth Tan finally signed the correct version in a discreet ceremony in the boardroom, he made a gesture that surprised everyone. Before putting pen to paper, he looked at Sarah, who was sitting in the corner of the room, and said, This contract exists because of you. This company still exists because of you. I still have the chance to be a better person because of you. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a performance. It was the naked truth of a man who looked deep inside himself and didn't like what he found, but decided to change. Sarah merely nodded, and that was enough. Some wounds don't heal with words. They heal with time and actions. Weeks later, Thomas Lee called Sarah to a private meeting. Just the two of them. I have a proposal, he said, pushing a document across the table towards her. Sarah read it. It was a proposal for reinstatement to legal practice. Thomas had hired, with his own resources, one of the country's leading law firms to review the process that had revoked her practicing certificate. They found serious irregularities in every complaint that had been made against her. Every accusation had been fabricated, every testimony bought. The firm had already filed the request for reversal with the Law Society of Singapore. When this is approved, Thomas said, and it will be approved because the truth has no expiry date. I want you to take over as legal director of Lee Holdings, not as a favor, not as thanks, but because there is no one more qualified in this country. Sarah looked at the document. The letters blurred because her eyes had welled up before she could stop them. It wasn't sadness. It was something she thought she would never feel again. Justice. The rare and overwhelming sensation that after years in the dark, someone had finally turned on the light. And David? She asked. David asked to be transferred to a branch office. He said he needs time to rethink what kind of professional he wants to be. I respected that. Sarah nodded. I accept, Mr. Thomas, but with one condition. What is it? That this company create a permanent internal listening program, a channel where any employee temp, intern, whoever can report problems without fear of retaliation, because what happened to me cannot happen to anyone else, ever again. Thomas smiled. The tired smile of someone who has seen the worst of human nature, but still believes in the best. Consider it done, and I want Priya Devi to coordinate this program. That night, Sarah arrived home and found Madam Lim and Ethan in the kitchen. Her mother was preparing pandan cake. The smell filled the entire apartment and transformed that small space into the most welcoming place in the world. Ethan was sitting at the table drawing another rocket, this time with 3 windows. Mummy, look! I put Grandma in the rocket too. Now all 3 of us are going to Jupiter. Sarah sat beside him and looked at the drawing. 3 stick figures, 3 hearts, A rocket pointed at the stars. "Mom," Sarah said, looking at Madame Lim, "I received a proposal today to return to practicing law, to take on a director position." Madame Lim dropped her wooden spoon, sat in a chair, and said nothing for several seconds. Then the tears came, silent, heavy, laden with years of struggle, of sleepless nights praying in the kitchen, of hands that held her daughter every time the world tried to knock her down. "I knew," Madame Lim whispered. "From the day you were born, I knew no one would ever be able to keep you down." Sarah hugged her mother. Ethan, without fully understanding what was happening, but sensing it was something beautiful, squeezed into the embrace. The three stayed there, in the kitchen that could fit entirely within Kenneth Tan's boardroom, but which had something no room in the world could buy. Love, real love, the kind that doesn't need a contract. Later, when the house was quiet, and Ethan was already asleep with his Jupiter book on his pillow, Sarah opened the closet drawer, took out the box, opened it, looked at the diplomas, certificates, and letters. And for the first time, she didn't feel longing for what she had lost. She felt proud of who she had become. She took the rocket drawing Ethan had made and put it inside the box, along with everything. Past and future, side by side. She closed the box, but this time she didn't put it at the back of the drawer. She placed it on top of the closet, in plain sight, where she could see it every day, because that box was no longer a secret, it was a trophy. Sometime later, on a random afternoon, Priya found Sarah in her new office, the legal director's office, with a city view, with a plaque on the door bearing her full name. Priya carried a coffee in each hand and a smile on her face. "You know what I sometimes think?" Priya said, sitting in the chair across the desk. "What? That Kenneth told you to call whoever you wanted, thinking you had no one on your side, and you called. And you did, and you always had." Sarah smiled. The smile of someone who had crossed the entire desert and found water on the other side. "You know what my mother always told me, Priya? That the strongest people in the world are not those who never fall. They are those who get up so silently that no one even noticed they had fallen." Priya raised her coffee, a toast then, to those who rise in silence. Sarah touched her cup to hers, to those who rise in silence. And outside the window, the city continued its indifferent rhythm. But inside that building, things would never be the same again. Because a woman everyone judged invisible proved that dignity is not measured by position, courage is not measured by salary, and a person's worth can never fit on an ID badge. The world doesn't know her name, but it should. Yeah,